Well, good evening, and thank you for being here. And this has been a few years in conversation. In the Diocese of Green Bay, where I live and was ordained a priest for, there is the Walk to Mary that begins at the Shrine of St. Joseph in De Pere, Wisconsin, a papally crowned statue of St. Joseph, and then takes people to the Shrine of Our Lady and Champion, a Marian apparition from 1859. So a few years ago, the Walk to Mary came to the West Coast, and you have your own version. It's a way to make pilgrimage and prayer and such, and the organizers of the Walk to Mary wanted me to come out at some point, and somehow got into conversation with Mariella, and that's how I ended up here today. And what a blessed experience, and what a beautiful church you have here. One of my specialties or areas of interest or research has been on the Champion apparition. I'll speak a little bit about Champion. I was prepared to give my talk that is on the lessons Mary taught at Champion. You might get that as a little bonus at the end. But with all the apparition shrines surrounding this church, I thought maybe I would give my talk on apparitions. I know many of you have actually been reading along with a Lenten journey with Mother Mary, which really takes some of the messages of Mary in her apparitions and applies them to themes throughout the Lenten season. I have a Lenten talk based on that book, but since you've been praying with that and reading it, meditating on it, many of the stories I would tell you about the pilgrim that I met in Lourdes who inspired the format of the book, to having dinner with a thief in Lourdes, France, to the healings that I've witnessed and such, you've probably already read, so I'll bear repeating those stories. The apparitions of Our Lady. She's been appearing for a very long time, in many different places, and we know that in the 1800s, many times in France, giving a message. One of the reasons I'm here today to give a talk about Mary and her apparitions is because they were so influential in my life. First, as a young person watching a movie that maybe many of you have seen, The Song of Bernadette. It was a movie that in my middle school and high school years, I would just watch it every now and again and just really be inspired and moved by the story of Saint Bernadette, the miracles and everything about it, just so impressive. When I was a young person too, at the age of 16, I went on a pilgrimage to Europe to a site of reported Marian apparition. And so that was very pivotal in my formation as a young person, and seeing kind of the universal nature of the church and all of these people gathered in prayer and praying and doing all the things you do when you visit an apparition site. Really left an impression on me. While I was at that place of apparition, I prayed, wondering if maybe God was calling me to be a priest. And I specifically remember my petition to the Lord was, and to Our Lady was, show me this where I live. Let me see the faith like this. Just a few months later, on August 15th, I went to the shrine in Champion. It was before it was approved. It was back in 2005 I was there. And as I drove up, as a 16-year-old with my driver's license, had to park on the road. There were so many cars, not enough places to park them all. The grounds were filled with people, and they processed around and prayed the rosary and gathered for Mass, just like that experience I had in Europe just a few months previous to that. In my life now, I have read about many of these apparitions. I have visited, I think, 10 of 10 apparition sites at least. Some alleged, reported apparition sites, others fully authenticated and validated by the church's process of evaluation. Champion was my first. Went there as an 8th grader, I think, 7th grader parish pilgrimage. My grandmother went. I was just a little kid on the trip. I served Mass. There was a picture of me in a cassock and surplice. It's been lost to antiquity, but I remember it. It was the first time I ever wore a cassock or surplice. Then I went to that alleged site. Maybe if you know, you know. But it was Medjugorje and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then to Borang and Beno in Belgium, to Rudebach and Pontmain and Lourdes and Fatima, Knock, Zaragoza, the alleged apparition site in Garabandal and Guadalupe. So some of those apparition sites have been approved and others are controversial or pending approval or whatever. So I want to speak about the themes of Mary's apparitions, but before I do so, what I want to do is kind of just set the stage for some of my own presuppositions, things that I believe about Marian apparitions. You could disagree with me on some of these points that I might bring up, but I think they're all pretty valid. The first is that Marian apparitions are the matter of private revelation. You need not believe that Mary has appeared in these places. In the trenches on Twitter and X and Facebook, when I see posts alleging that Fatima is demonic and all of these things, and seeing the comments of these people, I realize some Catholics don't believe in them. You're all here tonight. I believe that the majority of you believe in these apparitions. And maybe there's a skeptic who wants to hear something. So the apparitions are private revelation. What we need to believe in is the public revelation of the church. And the public revelation is that which ended with the death of the last apostle, St. John. What's contained in the scriptures and the canon of scripture, that's public revelation. That's what we need to give our full assent of belief to. My second belief about apparitions is that I believe that there are some apparitions that are a bit more personal in nature and others that were meant to be very public. I think even some of the more public apparitions may have been more personal in nature. I think the apparition in Champion, Wisconsin, actually received by this young Belgian immigrant who was 28 years old at the time. Her name was Adele Brice, depending which school you come from, but Adele receives these apparitions, but they're very much calling her to a specific mission. They're meant for her, but now as the church has evaluated them, this personal apparition has really become the part of the public devotional life of the church. That people go there on pilgrimage and they pray at the site where Mary appeared, and many graces, many conversions are granted there. Sometimes with these apparitions, Our Lady wanted them to be more public. She asked for a church to be built. She said in Borang, I have come so people can come on pilgrimage. So there's something very public about the request of Our Lady wanting people to go to these sites to pray in those churches that were built. The third thing I believe about apparitions is that I believe that there are many unreported apparitions. We readily can talk about the popular apparitions, that someone has gone to the local bishop and recounted their story, and then the church has evaluated. And then there are some apparitions too that maybe have looked at it and said, I don't know if this was really an apparition. But I think that there are some that have been unreported. For example, in The Glories of Mary by Alphonsus Liguori, a wonderful text. If you've never read it, I'd encourage you to do so. The Glories of Mary basically introduces Marian devotion and a lot of quotes from the saints. Like St. Alphonsus will say, well, St. Ildefonsus says this, or St. Bede the Venerable said this, or St. Bernard. And so quoting the saints and bringing together the tradition, and the Glories of Mary go through the Salve Regina, the different verses or different stanzas of the Salve. That's the method of teaching that St. Alphonsus uses. So he has this teaching that he gives about each phrase, but then it always ends with a little story. St. Alphonsus will recount that Our Lady came to this nun in some obscure convent and wherever, and that this nun was fortified in her faith as a result. So he recounts all of these different apparitions that really haven't ever been evaluated by the church. So that's what I mean by an unreported apparition. I think, too, that there are probably some pious people that have received apparitions of Our Lady, and maybe you know someone, I don't know, but that person who's received it, they're not going around and they're touting it. They're not publicizing it. But it's just a simple message that maybe Mary gave them in their prayer one day before the Blessed Sacrament or before an image of Our Lady. So I think that's an unreported type of apparition or locution that could happen. One time someone was recounting a story to me that they had arrived at a shrine to Our Lady in Belleville, Illinois, to the Shrine of Our Lady of the Snows. It was like 3 a.m., they were telling me, when they arrived at this shrine. They had gotten lost, or something happened, whatever the situation was, but they get to the property at 3 a.m. I was surprised they could even get in at that time. But as they were driving around the property, trying to find a place to stop for a little bit, the person said that this woman came up to their car window, gave them an apple, and then the woman said, "Feed this deer." It's an obscure story, but that person readily believes that Our Lady, for whatever reason, came to them, gave them that apple, and they fed that deer. But if you look at it, the story then, and begin evaluating it, well, the apple, we know, kind of the symbolic image of the forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden. And so Mary is the new Eve, and so correcting that original fault of Adam and Eve. That the deer, there have been different revelations with deer. For example, St. Hubert, a Belgian bishop, before he was a priest or a bishop, was hunting on one Good Friday. And as he was out hunting for the deer, instead of being in the church honoring the Lord's Passion, our Lord came to him as a deer approached him. The deer was one of these deer that in Wisconsin we would love to harvest and to put the head up on the wall of your living room or whatever. Let's say it was a 12-point buck or something. But that in the middle of those horns, the crucified Christ came to Hubert and said, soon you'll be hunting for souls. So a deer has been a mode through which a private revelation of the Lord has come. And then the deer, too, in the Psalms, as a deer longs for running water, so my soul thirsts for you. So as I heard that story and I began thinking about it, I thought, well, this isn't as crazy as it might sound. That maybe there's theological reasoning as to why it was, but an unreported apparition, one that wasn't evaluated, investigated by the church, but one that person felt compelled to tell me. I think there are lots of unreported apparitions. The fourth thing about apparitions is that there are different types of private revelation. So there are apparitions where Our Lady becomes present to the person, much like coming down from heaven, just like the Fatima children described, like this orb of light, and then Our Lady was there in front of them. So there are these apparitions themselves. Then there are visions. So I have been reading the mystical writings of Anne Catherine Emmerich, 4 volumes, 2,067 pages. The Life of Jesus Christ and Biblical Revelation. For Anne Catherine Emmerich, these are visions that she has, that she recounted to her spiritual director who wrote them down. So there are visions that are granted, and a person could then have that mode of receiving a message through them. And then there are locutions, which are the messages that are spoken, and sometimes they're audibly heard, sometimes they're heard within, that they're able to give expression to what they've heard. So there are different degrees of private revelations that a person could receive. The fifth thing about an apparition is that I also believe that a questionable apparition could have some advantage to a person. This is probably my most controversial point. They could propose a spirituality which is good, even when distinguished as separate from the apparitions themselves. So the one that I use for an example here is always the alleged apparition in Garabandal, Spain. That what Our Lady says, allegedly, to these children, she says, meditate on the Passion of Jesus often and make frequent visits to the Blessed Sacrament. Now, these are 2 very good spiritual disciplines that we do in our lives, whether we follow the apparition of Garabandal or not. They're just good for us spiritually. So I think maybe from some of these questionable apparitions could arise some good spiritual practice, even if the apparition isn't legitimate. So that's just an interesting observation that I've made. Another thing about apparitions is that there are some apparitions that I am not readily familiar with. I do not know anything. I couldn't begin telling you anything about the apparition of San Nicolas or the apparitions in San Nicolas, Argentina. It's just very uncharted waters for me. Now, I have a whole volume, like 600 pages or something. It's got a green cover on it. I want to read it one day, but I haven't made it to it yet. And so there are some apparitions you might want me to share that I don't know if I would be able to do so. The seventh is, I typically speak about apparitions in the context of Lent, as I mentioned, because of a Lenten journey with Mother Mary. But the manner in which I want to share today is a different paradigm for me to talk about apparitions. So here's a few reasons why Mary has come to earth with a message. So kind of looking at all of the apparitions, these are some of the common things that I've observed. The first is that Mary comes to encourage her people, to encourage her children, to encourage God's holy people. This was very evident in an apparition in Zaragoza, Spain. Now, some would argue that it wasn't an apparition. It's been called, or it is called, a bilocation, but typically, in common language, we say it's the first apparition of Our Lady. This bilocation of Mary, so that means she was still alive. She was in Jerusalem or she was in Ephesus, and at some point, she was granted by the Lord this knowledge that St. James the Greater, the apostle to Spain, was struggling in his faith, struggling in his zeal for evangelization. And so Our Lady goes there, bilocates. We call her Our Lady of the Pillar. She stands atop this pillar and she encourages St. James. Don't give up. Keep working for the conversion of souls. Keep preaching the gospel of my Son. St. James was at a low point. Mary came to encourage. And then in Borang, in Belgium. Borang is an apparition that took place in 1932 and 1933, began on the feast of St. Andrew on November 30th. There are different phases of the apparition according to scholars. They talk about the Advent phase, and then the Christmas phase, and then the New Year phase. So kind of looking at the different the different apparitions of Our Lady in that context. But when she comes, she appears to 5 children of the Degenbray and the Voisin family. And when Mary came, she encouraged them. She spoke very simple messages to them. She told them, always be good. Pray, pray always, pray very much. So very encouraging words to little children as they are living their faith. And then the champion apparition too. Maybe I'll share the entire message because I'll make references to champion throughout. This was the message Mary spoke to Adele on the 3rd occasion. Adele was told by the priest to ask Mary, in God's name, who are you and what do you want of me? And so when she saw Mary for the 3rd time, she asked that question. And Our Lady said, I'm the Queen of Heaven who prays for the conversion of sinners, and I wish you to do the same. You received Holy Communion this morning, and that is well, but you must do more. Make a general confession and offer your communion for the conversion of sinners. For if they do not convert and do penance, my Son will be obliged to punish them. And then Adele was accompanied by her sister and a neighbor, and they speak up. They say, Adele, who is it? Why can't we see her as you do? And Adele tells them to kneel. The woman says she's the Queen of Heaven, so they kneel down. And Mary says, looking at them, blessed are they who believe without seeing. And then Mary asks Adele a question. She says, why are you standing here in idleness while your companions are working in the vineyard of my Son? And Adele said, what am I to do? And Mary said, teach them their catechism. And Adele says, well, I know so little myself. And Mary says, teach them what they need to know for salvation, how to make the sign of the cross, how to approach the sacraments. This is what I wish you to do. Go and fear nothing, for I will help you. Mary comes to encourage, and I think those words to Adele, go and fear nothing, I will help you, those are great words of encouragement that encouraged Adele on her most difficult day, realizing that Mary would help her, that all she needed to do was say that Hail Mary or visit that spot of the apparition, between the two trees, and that Mary would help. She promised that. It's an encouraging message. The second common theme of an apparition is that Mary comes to call us to conversion. It was right there at the very beginning of that message in Champion. She said, "I am the Queen of Heaven who prays for the conversion of sinners, and I wish you to do the same." Go to confession, she said. But she comes to call us to change our lives. That if we look at these apparitions of Mary, it's often that there's something going on that the world needs to turn back to God. And so it's almost as if Mary goes to her son and says, "Send me with a message. They'll listen to me." She advocates. That's her role. She advocates for us. And so she comes to call us to conversion. That's what she's doing in heaven according to the Champion apparition, praying for conversion. That's our conversion. It's our family members. It's the conversion of our world. In the message of La Salette in 1846, Our Lady comes calling people to conversion. She specifically references instances in which people are not converted in their life, that they're disobeying the commandments of God. The first was because they continued to take his name in vain, and the second was they were not honoring the Sabbath. And so she draws the people's attention to those two commandments, calling them to conversion. Change your language, speak more godly ways, come back to church on Sunday. Mary comes to call to conversion there. There's a very powerful story of an apparition in Leylau, France. That's spelled Laus. I'm pretty sure it's in the Alps. In this apparition in Leylau, a young woman named Benedicta would be the English transliteration of her name. Benedicta Ronquerolles receives a message. It was back in the 1600s, and the apparition spanned about 30 years. And the apparition wasn't approved until, I think, 2009, so just more or less recently. But in this apparition, in one of the messages when Mary came, she said to Benedicta, "There's a woman over there, and she always takes the name of my son in vain. Go and tell her there will be no heaven for her if she doesn't stop taking the name of my son in vain." Benedicta, this young lady, goes over to the woman and says, "Mary has told me there will be no heaven for you unless you change your ways." And that woman on the spot converted, ceasing taking the name of the Lord our God in vain. I think you're all aware of how readily the name of God is taken in vain in television and film, at sporting events, and common speech. Mary comes to call to conversion to tell us that there will be no heaven for us if we don't stop. The third thing about apparitions is that Mary comes to tell us to pray. In Champion, she told Adele, "I'm the Queen of Heaven who prays for the conversion of sinners, and I wish you to do the same. You received Holy Communion this morning, and that is well, but you must do more. Make a general confession and offer your communion for the conversion of sinners." So Mary gives Adele a way in which she can offer her Holy Communion for the conversion of sinners. Every time we gather for the celebration of the Mass, the priest says, "Pray, brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father. You, the people, join your prayers to that of the priest who is offering the sacrifice, and so we can place on the altar someone in our life who needs conversion. It's a way in which Mary has asked that we could pray. In La Salette, she simply told Melanie and Maxim, say your morning and evening prayers. Very simple. A lot of times when I hear confessions, a very pious person might come in and they'll say, I forgot to say my morning prayers. They realize how important that is, and Our Lady simply reminds us, don't forget your morning and evening prayers. I've been hearing this story recently. I heard it twice. On my interview-based podcast, I interviewed someone, actually a year ago, it just came out though, like a few weeks ago, about near-death experiences. He had researched them, and the book was delayed in publication, but when I went back and re-listened to the episode before releasing it, he made reference to a priest named Father Stephen Shire. And then just yesterday, as I was watching a reel or something on Instagram, another name, Father Dan Rehill, this popular exorcist from Nashville, he was preaching about Father Stephen Shire, and the impression I received was that Father Stephen had neglected his breviary, his morning and his evening prayer, and his divine office. And so he had this near-death experience of a car accident, and he was going to be judged and sent to hell. But Our Lady advocated, and one of the things, you have to be more faithful to this prayer of the church that you've promised to pray, to say our morning and evening prayers. Your parish prays Vespers, how beautiful. And so that's a way we say our prayers in the evening. At the apparition in Fatima, Our Lady said, pray the rosary every day for peace in the world. That's a prayer, a request she made. She taught us another prayer at Fatima, the O my Jesus, forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell. Lead all souls to heaven, especially those who are most in need of thy mercy. She also taught the children, Francisco and Jacinta, a prayer to make sacrifice and offering for sinners. O my Jesus, I offer this for love of thee, for the conversion of sinners, and in reparation for the sins committed against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. These are ways that she's asked us to pray. Today in my book, A Lenten Journey with Mother Mary, was brought to my attention. It's the week of these different methods of prayer. Our Lady of Kibeho, who's one of the statues over there, she appears to these children in Rwanda and asked that the Rosary of the Seven Sorrows be prayed on Tuesdays, the Servite Rosary as it's commonly called. But she's come to tell us to pray, and she's made specific requests. This is how you could pray. We listen to that voice, that message, knowing that we need to pray more in our life. Another common thing about these apparitions is that Mary comes so that we can go on pilgrimage. I mentioned that at the beginning. That's what she said in Borang to these 5 children. I have come so that people will come on pilgrimage. During World War II, as the war was going on, soldiers marched by the sanctuary in Borang, Belgium. And as they did so, they would stop and they'd light a candle to Our Lady. They'd seek her prayers. There's an apparition in England dating back to the 1200s called Our Lady of Walsingham. It was at a time when pilgrimage to the Holy Land really wasn't possible, and Our Lady comes and she builds Nazareth in this little village of Walsingham. Much like the reason why we have the Stations of the Cross was because there was a time when pilgrims couldn't go to those spots, and so the Stations of the Cross came about as a result. But when Our Lady appears to this woman, she's a woman of nobility. Her name is escaping me right now. I'm embarrassed to say that. I'm trying to think of it, but I could see her picture. Nevertheless, in this Walsingham apparition, though, Mary, it's called England's Nazareth. So to build Mary's house there in England, and this woman was given the dimensions of the house and instructions on how to build it. Racheldis is her name, and so Racheldis builds this little house of Mary in England. The apparition in Tepeyac in Guadalupe, it's a popular destination of pilgrimage that people come and see that miraculous image impressed on Juan Diego's tilma. Am I not here who am your mother? She comes so that we can go on pilgrimage and be reminded that she's our mother and that we're in her house when we're in her shrine. Another thing about apparitions is that Mary comes to emphasize church teaching. There, in the Guadalupe apparition, Mary says, "I'm the mother of the true and living God. I'm the ever-virgin mother of God." I think one of the sad things about our dogmas of Mary is that we don't have a feast day for Mary, ever-virgin, a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ. We have the motherhood of God, we have the Assumption, we have the Immaculate Conception, but ever-virgin, we don't have that feast day. But in Guadalupe, to Juan Diego, she says that she's ever-virgin. Someone tells you that Mary had other children. Well, no, she said, "I'm ever-virgin." The church teaches this, and Guadalupe seems to affirm it. In Rue de Bac, Our Lady comes in 1831 to St. Catherine Labouré. She says, "Have an image struck, O Mary, conceived without original sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." So that little prayer, it's emphasizing Mary without sin. O Mary conceived without sin, the Immaculate Conception. And as you all know, in 1858, 4 years after the dogmatic definition, Mary appears to Bernadette and says, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And when the parish priest questioned Bernadette, when she uttered the words Immaculate Conception, he knew that this had to be from heaven, because there's no way that this young girl would have known about this complex teaching about Mary. There are other dogma, there's a fifth dogma that people are advocating for, and there have been private revelations that have spoken about that and encouraged its declaration. So if it comes to pass and happen, one could look to those apparitions as support for that. Mary also comes in her apparitions to mediate grace and healing. In Rudebach, in this convent where Catherine Labouré was, in the miraculous medal. We call it the miraculous medal because people began wearing it and they received unexplained, miraculous happenings in their life because of that medal. It changed its very name. In Lourdes, we have the healing waters. In Benoît, Belgium, there's also a spring of water that Mary says that she had come to set it apart for the healing of the nations. In Champion, there was a great fire that took place in 1871. It was threatening the place where the shrine was, the chapel, the convent, the school. Adele and the sisters and the school children and local people from the community gathered in prayer. And by the powerful intercession of Mary, the next morning, which happened to be October 9th, the day that Mary had appeared back in 1859, that on October 9th of 1871, the fire had passed over the property. These places of apparition have been places where God has chosen to impart his graces to his people through the intercession of Mary. People will often ask, what's the proof of this Marian devotion? Why go to Our Lady? I always simply tell them, it seems like it works. People have done it over and over, and we have countless stories of graces that have been received when people have cried out to Our Lady. She comes for grace to be given and healing. And then Mary comes to be with God's people. In an apparition in France called Pontmain, takes place during the Franco-Prussian War. I won't give you a date, I'll tell you when it took place. Franco-Prussian War. And there was a battle that was going to be happening. And Our Lady comes, and there are 3 phases of the apparition. The message is written in the sky, and only these children there could see the apparition. But as the apparition was occurring in Pontmain, maybe 30 miles away, some distance, one of the armies that was going to be marching through that town could go no further. They said something was preventing them from pressing on. It was at the exact time that apparition was taking place. And so, Mary comes to be with God's people at a time of war. Or in Knock, Ireland, during the time of struggle and famine and the troubles and all of that, Our Lady comes, is seen by what are called witnesses. They're not called visionaries, witnesses of the apparition. But Our Lady and St. Joseph and St. John and the Lamb on the altar glorified, an image of adoration, that Mary with these surrounding her just abided, remained with God's people at that time. The rector of the shrine in Knock says that it was Our Lady being in solidarity with them. So her presence is meant to help them, kind of like encouragement, but I think a little different. Mary also comes to call us back to the sacraments. In Champion, it was to confession and Eucharist. In Fatima, on the first Saturdays, go to Mass, receive Holy Communion, make your confession. And Knock, the Lamb on the altar glorified, Eucharistic adoration. When I hear confessions on first Saturdays, I often think about this. I think to myself, if everybody in my church really took to heart this message of Our Lady to Sister Lucia, to go to confession once a month, this is Our Lady's spiritual program, I would never stop hearing confessions. There would be such a great demand. And so she calls to give us that spiritual program, which is the Eucharist and confession, inviting us to celebrate those sacraments. And then Mary comes to, at times, with a word of prophecy or warning. In Champion, she says, "My son will be obliged to punish them." It's a warning, in a sense. Some people, they actually don't like that chastisement language of Our Lady. They kind of dismiss the apparition because of it. This one theologian wrote a whole article in a journal. I just found it the other day, actually, but I rediscovered it. It was in a pile of papers, and I'm like, oh yes, this person wrote that. My son will be obliged to punish them. It's a warning. It's a conditional statement. In Fatima, pray the rosary every day to prevent a worse war from breaking out. Well, that war broke out, and so does that mean we didn't pray? The people didn't pray hard enough. Then in Cabejo, she said that a river of blood would flow through the country, and the Rwandan genocide took place. So Mary's messages sometimes have warned and prepared people for what was to come. And maybe there are messages today that are ongoing, that are serving that purpose too, and the church discerns those apparitions and those messages. And if nothing else, I think what Our Lady's messages tell us is seek God, pray often, make sure that your life is always right with God. These messages of Mary are really her coming to be our mother, to help us at all these different times in our life. There are so many messages of Our Lady. I haven't even touched all of them. I look around and there are a few statues of Mary, like this Philippine one, or the one from China over here. I'm a little unfamiliar. We'll have to read a little bit about them. But there are so many apparitions, so many messages of Our Lady. We become more aware of those messages, and they speak to us, and then we try our best to live them. Knowing them is not enough. We have to listen to them. But listening isn't enough. We have to live them. Her messages are meant to help us on our path to salvation. Live her messages, rely on her prayers, and hopefully we'll see that woman that St. Bernadette described as the most beautiful woman she ever saw. If we listen to these messages and live them, well then we will be hopefully made worthy of the promises of Christ. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about Mary's apparitions tonight, and hopefully as you continue with a Lenten journey with Mother Mary, that maybe more of her messages and such will continue to speak to you, and maybe as you learn about some of these apparitions that maybe you hadn't heard of, like Leilao, that you'll go and you'll learn more, and Mary will continue to speak so that we might listen.